Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining this very important discussion on gerrymandering. I've got a special guest here today, Professor Kenneth Stahl from Chapman University Dale Fowler School of Law, who teaches a number of subjects, including politics and elections and property. He is an expert in this field, and he is going to share some valuable information with us. Thank you so much, Professor Stahl, for joining us.
Well, thank you, Alannah. It's a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate you inviting me.
Absolutely. So we're just going to jump right in. But before we do, I have to give a disclaimer. Um, the Western region of the National Black Law Students Association and the Orange County NAACP are both 501c3 nonprofits. We don't engage in any political discourse. We don't choose sides, and we are definitely not telling you how to vote. This session is 100% informational, just to share with you all what gerrymandering is, the history of gerrymandering, where the name came from, and how it affects elections. So with that being said, Professor Stahl, can you give us a little bit of history around how the term gerrymandering ever became a term?
Sure. So just to start with what gerrymandering is, gerrymandering is kind of a byproduct of districting. Uh, Whenever you're creating any kind of legislative districts, you have to decide how the lines are drawn. And I'll show you a couple of pictures here to illustrate. Um, so, for example, I'll show that slide later. Here is a district map of the city of Anaheim in California. In Anaheim, there are six city council districts, or city count. There are six city council members. They are elected from single member districts. So that requires the city to create six districts, as you can see here. Um, and here's another example from Irvine. They also have six districts. So the city is divided up geographically into six districts, and that's how they're elected. This is also typically how legislators are elected in state legislatures and for Congress. So, for example, California is assigned, because of our population, 52 members of the House of Representatives. And you can see on this map that those members are each elected from a geographic district within the state. So this is the process of districting. Um, and Gerrymandering is a term that is often used it's not a precise legal term. It's a term that's used kind of derisively to refer to when districting is done with like a nefarious purpose,
Mm.
with an illicit purpose. So, for example, when districts are drawn to favor incumbents, or they're drawn to favor a particular party, or they're drawn to favor a particular race, those would all be examples of situations where the districting might be described as gerrymandering. So it's just a derogatory term that's used to describe when districting is done in a way that's considered illicit, not necessarily illegal, but that's considered kind of um, inappropriate or bad.
How do
So that's
how do they determine where the lines are drawn? And because I saw in the first graphic that you had, it's not necessarily even. So how do they determine where the line is drawn?
Yes, that's a very good question, and this leads right into the question of gerrymandering. And let me just say first, because I never answered your question from earlier, where the name comes from. It's actually an interesting history, and I think 1832, the governor of Massachusetts was named Elbridge Gerry, and he was the governor of Massachusetts who originally created a districting map for the state of Massachusetts that was perceived to favor his party. And critics attacked the maps that he used, and they particularly called out one district in the state that was so weirdly shaped that they said it looked like a salamander.
Mhm.
And the opponents kind of put together Jerry with salamander, and said this is gerrymandering. And that's where the name came from. Now, your question is really important. And again, I'm going to go back to the map again here. Um, once you're absolutely right that once districts are once it's decided to elect members by district, that then raises the question of how the line gets drawn, how the lines get drawn, and who draws them. And this becomes very controversial and necessarily political because however the lines are drawn determines who wins and who loses. So, in terms of what the criteria are that are supposed to be used to draw the lines, there really aren't that many neutral, principled criteria. The one criterion that must absolutely be followed legally is the one person, one vote rule, which is each district must be equipopulous, right? In any system where you're using districts, and you don't always have to use districts. For example, local governments sometimes don't use districts at all. But if you're going to use districts, that each district has to be equipopulous. And that can be why, as you see here, and you'll see in any other district map, the districts won't all be the same size geographically, because of course, urban places tend to be much more populous than rural places. So the rural districts will be a lot smaller because they all have to have the same number of people. Beyond that, there are not really any legal requirements as to how districts must be created. So, for example, it isn't necessarily illegal to draw districts to favor incumbents. It isn't necessarily illegal to draw districts to favor a particular party. Um, there are situations where it can be, according to the Supreme Court, unconstitutional to draw districts that favor a certain race. That can be unconstitutional depending on how it's done. Um, but otherwise, there's not a lot of rules. So, for example, do districts have to be compact? Do they have to be contiguous? Do they have to have a certain shape? Not necessarily. Do they have to overlap with counties? Do they have to overlap with political jurisdictions? Not necessarily. Some states may have rules about that, but as a matter of federal constitutional law, there really aren't that many rules. And so that means that the lines, the way the lines are drawn is largely, again, a political matter. And in most states, it's the legislators themselves who determine how the lines get drawn.
How often are these lines drawn, and what is the standard to say, okay, now it's time to redraw the lines?
So the normal time to redraw the lines would be after every census. Census is taken every 10 years. And the reason for that is because, as I just said, the districts do have to be equipopulous. And so every 10 years, when the census is taken, you get kind of a new snapshot of where people are located. And so you may have to redraw the district lines to make them equipopulous again. So usually the district lines are redrawn every 10 years or so. They can be drawn more frequently, but that's less common and can be somewhat more controversial.
So, why would legislators want to redraw lines? What would be the purpose, the ultimate goal in saying, okay, let's redraw the line, especially if it's not during a census?
So if it's not in response to changes in population, then there's probably a few reasons, and there are many reasons why legislators choose to draw lines a certain way. Some of which you might consider to be legitimate, and others you might not. Um, so, uh, so lines might be drawn to respect historical boundaries, to capture communities of interest, geographic areas, people that are perceived as having a certain common interest. They may also be drawn to, as we talked about before, to give a party a particular advantage. They may be drawn to give incumbents a certain advantage. Um, they may be drawn to create partisan balance between the parties. That can be done as well. So those would be kind of the normal things that would go into the process of determining how lines get drawn.
How many people are in each district?
Well, that would depend on how many seats there are. Right? So in California, where we have about 40 million people and 52 congressional districts, right? So I'm not sure exactly what that translates to, but what, 700,000 in each district or so. And then, so that just complete, and so it completely depends at the local level. A city charter may dictate how many council members there are. So
Mhm.
they can be quite small, depending on the size of the city and how many legislators there are, or they can be very big. In California, our state legislative districts are enormous. So, for example, the state Senate only 80 senators for 40 million people, right? So,
Oh, I'm sorry. I think I accidentally muted you.
no problem.
Okay.
So that would mean that right there's what a couple million people, no, not a couple million, there's about 500,000 people in each state Senate district. Whereas in other places like New Hampshire, I think there's like 400 members of the lower house of the state legislature. So they each one would only represent maybe a few hundred people.
I'm going to take a little bit of a step back because I'm not sure where all of our viewers are as far as understanding what an incumbent is and why redistricting would matter to an incumbent.
Sure. So an incumbent refers to a person who is currently in office. And the main thing that an incumbent typically wants is to get reelected. And so that means that the way the district lines are drawn are extraordinarily important to the incumbent because they can be drawn in a way to make it easy for that person to be reelected or to make it hard for that person to be reelected.
How
So,
is
for
that possible?
example,
Yeah,
hmm?
yeah, yeah. You
So, for
were
example, if,
about to
if
go into
district
it.
lines are redrawn to put two incumbents against each other, then one of them is going to lose their job.
Hmm.
And so that's one thing that incumbents often try to avoid. And considering that the incumbent legislators are typically not in many states the people who actually draw the district lines, they often are tempted to favor themselves.
Is the general public aware of where they are in these lines and how do they find out in a way that really makes a difference about how they're voting?
It's usually pretty easy to look online to see what legislative district you're in. You can usually just put your address. You can usually just put your address in, and it will tell you what your district is and who your legislator is. Um, it may be a little bit more difficult to determine if your district has been gerrymandered, and what that means for you. There have been some political scientists who've tried to measure gerrymandering and kind of create standards for how to know when you're in a gerrymandered district. But that can be very difficult for members of the general public to find out.
So how does this redistricting actually affect elections? Can you kind of give us a visual of what is actually happening uh, when a district has been redrawn or gerrymandered?
Sure, absolutely. And in fact, let me show you another picture here. Um, this is, I think, oh, sorry, right here. Maybe the best graphic I've seen to describe how gerrymandering works, because it really shows you how it can work in a way to disenfranchise people. So in this hypothetical, you can see that you have a district where 60% of 50 people, 60% of them are blue and 40% are red. And you can see there's at least three different ways you could draw the district lines here. In this first one, you could create three blue districts and two, and it's what the graphic describes as perfect representation. Okay, meaning that the way that you have three blue representatives and two red ones, which perfectly mirrors the composition of the electorate. This is what you would call proportional representation. The second one is one that is described as compact but unfair. It packs a minority of the red voters into five blue districts. So blue wins each time. And then on the end here is maybe the most kind of pernicious of them, in that you can see that you can actually draw these lines so that red wins 3 districts to 2, even though only 40% of the constituents are in the red here. So gerrymandering, as you can see here, can work in a way that members of the minority, let's say this is a party, members of the minority party can actually be deprived of an opportunity at fair representation, or the opposite, that the minority can actually deprive the majority of fair representation. And I should say, this is particularly likely to happen if you have what's called polarization. Like we're assume for the sake of example that the red and blue people hate each other, right? And
Hmm.
they would never vote the same way on anything. There would never be an opportunity for coalition building. So if that were the case, in example two, the red voters would be just completely silenced. And in the third one, the blue voters would not be silenced, but they would not be represented to the degree that is proportional to their share of the population. So that's kind of what's often perceived as the democratic problem, the problem democracy wise that's presented by gerrymandering.
Yeah, it almost seems like there's never really any fair way to draw these lines. But there are some ways that are very unfair. And the last one seems like it would take a very technical approach to drawing these lines. You would have to have a really good idea of who was in each district, and that's captured from the census, correct?
Yes, that's right. So a couple of things here. First of all, what you said, Alana, is exactly, I mean, almost literally what Justice Sotomayor said dissenting in the Rucho versus Common Cause case, which is the recent Supreme Court case in which the court said that partisan gerrymandering was a non-justiciable political question. The court said that there's no way to determine when districting is fair. And Sotomayor's response was, yes, that's right, but we certainly know when it's really unfair.
Mhm.
That's a very close approximation of what she had said in that case. Um, as far as the other, I'm sorry, I was forgetting what was the question you asked?
I would think I was asking about, just the overall fairness and how there just seems to be no way to make it fair, but there's definitely a way to make it unfair.
Yes, I think
Um,
there's more. Yes, there's many ways of making it unfair. I think the question that the court has confronted and struggled with is how do we determine when it's unfair,
mhm,
considering that, as we just talked about, there it really isn't a principled way that lines should be drawn. Oh, and I think this is getting to your question. How do you know what kind of voters are in each district and that
mhm,
sort of thing?
mhm.
That's also what you were asking. So we have very sophisticated computer models now that didn't used to exist, and this is why one of the many reasons why gerrymandering has become a much more significant political issue in the last decade. Um, Computer models now can provide very detailed descriptions of the demographics of people living in each district. And so it's very easy for map makers to just tweak the lines a little bit on a simulated map and show you exactly what the demographics of the district are going to look like, partisan wise, race wise, and in every regard. And so it's become much easier to do this kind of thing. So that sort of third scenario I mentioned, right? That is much more likely to happen in a situation where we have the complex computer models, where you know exactly the partisan distribution of everyone in your district. And we also know that today, unlike in the past, most people don't change their partisan affiliation,
Mhm.
right? So once you know someone's voted Democrat in the last 3 elections, voted Republican in the last 3 elections, it's very easy to model the likely electorate in the next election.
I see that I saw something today where Jasmine Crockett said that they drew the lines where they drew her out of her seat. How can something like that happen? It doesn't seem like in the middle of someone's term they can be drawn out of their seat.
So it absolutely creates the appearance of unfairness, as we've talked about, but it's not entirely inconsistent with our political tradition.
Mhm.
I mean, James Madison was almost gerrymandered out of his House district in Virginia in the very first congressional election by his political opponents. So, I mean, it's been happening for a very long time, and it happens for partisan reasons. It happens for other reasons too. I mean, but there's no doubt that's what's happening now is unusual. It is unusual to do districting mid-election. It's unusual to do it as kind of in such an openly partisan way. Um, but it's not completely unprecedented to do this kind of partisan gerrymandering.
If the Supreme Court is saying that this is non-judiciable and they're saying, hey, leave us out of this, who is the oversight? Like, how is this rectified? Who oversees the nefarious type of redistricting?
So there's a few ways that it can be addressed, but it's kind of minimal. One is state courts. The Supreme Court said that although partisan gerrymandering is non-justiciable as a matter of federal constitutional law, state courts can still find that it's unconstitutional under state law. So we have had a few state Supreme Courts that have struck down excessive partisan gerrymandering under state constitutions. And I believe, according to Utah, actually just held that Utah's congressional maps were unconstitutional under Utah's state constitution. Um, Another way that partisan gerrymandering can be attacked federally is if it can be um, plausibly uh, explained as racial gerrymandering.
Hmm.
Partisan lines often overlap in many states with racial lines. And the Supreme Court has been pretty clear that that racial gerrymandering, that is using race consciousness as part of the drawing of district lines, that can be unconstitutional as well as potentially a violation of the Voting Rights Act. So sometimes attacks on partisan gerrymandering have succeeded where you could make the argument that there was also racial gerrymandering. So that's a second way. A third way is the voters can actually, in many states, use the initiative process to prohibit partisan gerrymandering and create a nonpartisan commission to create the district lines. That's what we've done in California, and many other states have done that also. So that's one way to prevent gerrymandering. Of course, one thing that we're now seeing is if some states do it and other states don't, then you kind of have a unilateral disarmament in the war against partisan gerrymandering.
So talk a little bit about that, right? So how does what's happening in Texas and what is potentially going to happen here in California, how does that affect the elections in the future? And
So
how do
what's
those
happening
two
in
things
Texas?
work together? Like, are they part of the same animal or are they totally separate?
Oh, you mean what California is doing and what Texas is doing?
Hmm.
Yes, they're completely interrelated. So what's happening in Texas is that the president basically expressed his wish that more Republican districts be created to ensure that congressional districts to ensure that Republicans would be able to maintain their control of the House of Representatives after the midterm elections in 2026. Typically, the party out of power wins a lot of seats in the off-year elections. And so I would think that Democrats would probably be favored to retake the House. And so his idea was let's try to get more Republican seats by essentially doing partisan gerrymandering in Texas to create five more Republican seats. And so the Texas legislature and governor agreed to do that and have, in fact, now created new congressional maps mid-decade in order to create more Republican seats. Again, mid-decade redistricting is unusual because usually you do the redistricting after congressional elections. Normally, the only reason you would do a mid-decade redistricting is for some partisan purpose. In this case, it isn't exactly being hidden. It's being openly stated that the reason is to create more Republican seats. So California has said that it's going to respond to Texas's partisan gerrymandering by creating an additional five Democratic House districts in California. But it's a lot harder for California to do than Texas because, as I said earlier, California has a citizens redistricting commission created by ballot initiative, which is in the California Constitution. So, and that's a nonpartisan citizens commission. So California legislature can't do what Texas did and just change the congressional maps. They have to go to the voters and ask the voters to amend the Constitution. And so that's what the governor of California and the Democrats in the state legislature are asking the voters of California to do, to pass this initiative that would essentially create five more Democratic congressional seats in California. And then, by the way, Republicans are responding to that by, again, gerrymandering additional states. So Missouri just adopted a partisan gerrymandering scheme to create additional Republican seats. And I think Ohio, Florida, maybe a couple other states are thinking of doing the same. So that's kind of what's going on right now.
It's almost like two toddlers hiding the toys from each other.
Yeah, that's part of that. That's definitely the game, the game of partisan warfare for sure.
Yeah. I also have to, I think this is a good time to say once again that we are a nonprofit and we do not take sides on either side. This is just strictly informational. We have a question. Um, it states, I am most interested in alternatives to incumbents drawing the lines. I know the big thing now is citizen committees. Is this a good solution or does it pose its own problems?
Well, one problem with the Citizen Commission is it's actually not clear if it's constitutional, at least when it comes to congressional elections, because the way the Constitution's written, the state legislature is supposed to decide the process by which congressional candidates are elected. If a citizens commission is choosing the process, the argument is that's not the legislature choosing the process by which congressional candidates are elected. Now, the Supreme Court has already ruled in one case that the legislature can include the public acting pursuant to its initiative power. But it's possible that that question will come back again. So there is some legal question still about the constitutionality of citizens commissions like California. The other problem with it is what we've just described, which is it can be a form of unilateral disarmament if some places are doing it and then other places are not. And then a third reason would just be that maybe that some people prefer to have politicians drawing the lines because the process is political. You do have to have some knowledge of where the relevant communities are, what the relevant interests are, and how they correspond to geography. And a nonpartisan citizens commission, you could argue, doesn't have that same level of knowledge about local conditions and local needs that elected politicians do. I think that would be probably the substantive argument against citizen commissions.
It seems really difficult. I mean, I know you said that we've got these computer systems, but it seems, before the systems were in place, really difficult to draw these lines. What would happen if they just drew blocks, kind of like the way Middle America was separated? What would be the outcome?
Well, remember that it's very difficult to do that because you have to follow the equal population rule, right? So population isn't distributed in equal blocks. So you really couldn't do that in a way that would respect one person, one vote.
Hmm.
Now, before the one person, one vote rule in the 60s, a lot of districts were done that way, and then they never changed the boundary lines. And you could argue that that was better, that you just never had gerrymandering because you just left the lines in place once you drew them there. But of course, the problem that occurred by the 1960s was the districts were unbelievably malapportioned, in which some people had 10 times the voting power of others, and particularly people living in urban areas were having much less voting power than people living in rural places because population movement from rural to urban, but the district lines weren't changing. So, right, there's kind of trade-offs any way that you do it, but you can see it really isn't possible to do it in those like equal blocks. There has to be some discretion in how the lines are drawn. And once you introduce that discretion, then the question is, well, how do we make the lines fair? And that's really hard to do.
Yeah, it sounds like it's really hard to do and that it's been tried a few different ways. And if you've got the technology to keep the upper hand, then of course you would do that. But do the citizens, say, for example, in Texas, can they work with a particular legislator to enact something like what California has, where there's a nonpartisan committee that works to make sure that those lines are fairly drawn to keep something like this from happening in the future? And who does it really benefit?
Well, I don't know what the initiative process is like in Texas, or if they have a process by which voters can put matters into the Constitution through the ballot, the way California does. California, it has a very liberal, and I don't mean liberal in the sense politically, but liberal in the sense of very permissive ballot initiative system, where it's very easy to get a measure onto the ballot and then for it to become part of our Constitution, which is why our Constitution is as thick as a novel. I mean, it's a 300-page long Constitution. I don't know what the procedures are in Texas for doing that, but you would have to have a groundswell of popular support for that sort of thing, assuming that it was possible to get it on the ballot. Texas is a very difficult state to organize because it's a huge state, not just population wise, but geographically. There's lots of people living in small parts of very rural counties. And so it's difficult to get messages out on a statewide basis. So I could see it being very challenging to do that. And you'd need to have a real groundswell of support for it. And I haven't seen any polling on it to see how it's doing in Texas. But I would have to assume that if voters in Texas were really angry about this, the legislature wouldn't be doing it.
Yeah. So back to California and how these lines are drawn based on the census and who lives in those areas. It's really kind of difficult to predict nowadays, isn't it? Like we have a large majority of people who are of Hispanic descent, possibly voting Republican. You know, Black people are kind of moving out of California, and the percentage of Black people in the area have gone down. And even with that, we don't know how those voters are going to vote, whether they're voting Democratic or Republican. How can they actually draw these lines if people are kind of, you know, morphing into different spaces that are a little bit more unpredictable?
Yeah, so and this I think is we'll see how it plays out, but this is one of the risks of the partisan gerrymandering, the kind of extreme partisan gerrymandering we're seeing in Texas. Because first of all, states like Texas were already gerrymandered. They're just doing it even more. And there's a limit to how much of it you can do. In order to create five more districts, what Texas really has to do is thin out their majority. That means they have to go from having districts that are, say, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but this is hypothetical. Districts that are, say, 70% Republican to districts that are 65%, or districts that are 65% Republican down to 60, right? So they can spread, it's like you're spreading some jelly on a piece of bread, right? Like you've got to spread those Republican voters out more thinly, right, to create more Republican districts. And as you're doing that, you are creating the risk that if you have any crossover voters, any voters who change their partisan affiliation from one election to the next, that's going to flip that district,
Hmm.
right? Whereas if you have a district that's 65% Republican or whatever, you're not worried about that. If it's 55, if it's 52%, then you're really banking on partisanship being super firm. So that is kind of the risk that's taken when you go to this level of extremes with the partisan gerrymandering.
Interesting. So, if I understand what you said correctly, they're kind of watering down their own votes by infiltrating Democratic spaces in the hopes that they will win districts that were historically Democratic by putting more Republicans in that space.
Right, they're gonna do there's a couple of tactics that would often be used. One is what's called packing, and we can see this in the graphic I showed you earlier. Let's see if I can put this back up here. Um, yeah, so if you look at the third slide, excuse me, the third number three, neither compact nor fair. The way that you get three red and two blue districts, even though red is in a minority here, is by you can see packing all the blue voters. So the two majority blue districts, almost all the voters are blue,
Mm,
right? You see that?
mhm.
And then in the red districts, you can see it's only a bare majority of the voters who are red. That's how you do it. So the red voters are being spread out among the districts, and the blue are being packed as tightly as possible. So that's kind of the strategy is to pack the Democratic voters, in the case of Texas, into districts where the Democrats get 80 or 90% of the vote, which is actually relatively easy to do because Democratic voters tend to be very highly concentrated in urban areas. And then take the Republican voters who tend to be less heavily concentrated and spread them out some more. That would be the way to do that.
Very interesting. I love that graphic. It makes it make a lot of sense. But it's still, it just like what I'm walking away with is that one, there is no fair way to do this. And two, the person that thinks that they're winning by doing this very well could lose by doing this. It's no guarantee that this will put them in the best position. Is that a fair?
Right. No, I agree with both of those things. I don't know that there's any really fair way of doing it, although I agree. Yeah, I don't know. Yes, I agree that I don't know there's any fair way of doing it. And yes, it is. We haven't really seen it yet, but the more you do this, the more thinly you spread your voters, the more you do create that risk that you may have gone too far and you may accidentally flip a district.
Thank you so much. We're now going to open up the last 15 minutes to Q&A. If anybody has any questions, feel free to just raise your hand. I'll acknowledge you and you can ask questions. Is there anything else, Professor Stahl, that you feel like we need to know as voters? Again, not taking any particular side, but just to better understand what's going to happen in this special election and how our vote can affect uh, can either go positively or negatively.
So you mean in terms of Prop 50, the
Yes,
proposition in California?
yes.
Yes. So I can just briefly tell you what I think the sort of arguments are for each side, right? So Prop 50 is a ballot measure that, as I kind of described a little bit earlier, would basically cancel the current congressional maps that were created by the Nonpartisan Citizens Commission and substitute a map that was created by Democrats in the California state legislature for the current congressional cycle only, and then excuse me, for the current remaining part of this decade only, and then return to the Citizens Commission for 2031. The argument in favor that's been made by Governor Newsom and others is that this is a unfortunate necessity to respond to Republican extreme gerrymandering. That if they're going to try to disenfranchise Democrats in Texas and potentially take the House of Representatives through this process of extreme partisan gerrymandering, that California basically has no choice but to respond in order to cancel out the advantage that Texas has given itself. Um, the argument against, which is coming from former Governor Schwarzenegger, who was governor at the time that the nonpartisan districting process was created, is partisan gerrymandering is bad. And California has been a leader in stopping it through this commission process. And once we create loopholes for it, then the loopholes are going to swallow the rule, and the whole thing that we created is going to be lost.
Mm.
So those are the kind of the two sides of the argument.
So, but there's no real, even though it's drawn this way, we don't really know if they'll actually win those 5 seats. Is that a correct?
Yes, absolutely. The maps have been created in a way, just as I described, using computer modeling in a way that the Democrats think will advantage Democrats, right, based on their knowledge of the demographics and politics of the state. But there's absolutely no way to be sure of how people will vote, what turnout will look like, any of those things.
So it is a huge risk to do it both for, the other states and California to step out and try this, redistricting as a last ditch chance to get more seats. It's not a definite, it's not a a hole in one. There's no shot in the bucket that says this is the way to win.
Right. And on that note, I should also say that the politicians doing this aren't only doing it to win these congressional seats. They're also doing it as a sort of signal of partisan loyalty to
Mhm.
base voters and politicians in the party. So for Greg Abbott, the governor of Texas, and the Texas Republican legislators, they want to show the president and Republican base voters that they're committed to Republican control of the House. For Newsom and the Democrats, they want to show Democratic based voters that they're controlled to Democratic control of the House. And there's definitely some evidence that voters have been energized over this, that they care about this, the base voters anyway. And so there may be political advantage, right, just in the fact that those politicians, again, are kind of riling up the base, right? There's value in that, even if it doesn't result in the additional seats, and just sort of
Mhm.
showing that you're fighting for the cause.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for clarifying that. I'm going to take any questions that you all may have. If not, then we'll let Professor Stahl go. But I know I personally have a better idea on what gerrymandering is. It's a form of redistricting that draws the district maps in a way that might favor an incumbent or another party, whereas redistricting seems like what the legislator does to kind of produce the most fair one person, one vote opportunity for voters to have their voice heard as a group. Is so unless you all have some questions, we'll stay on for a while if you have any other questions, but I feel like I have a better understanding of what's happening now, and now I can go into the conversation. Did we have a hand raise? Okay. Well, I definitely feel like I can go into this conversation now having a better understanding of how redistricting works, what gerrymandering is, the history of gerrymandering, and to better prepare me for our next segment, which is on really going through the language in Prop 50. Again, I have to say that I am not influencing anyone to vote or vote in a particular direction. This is just informational so that you all can make the best decision with the information that you have, understanding how and what gerrymandering is and how these districts are drawn, and also the challenges that we as a community face in this democracy and how we can be a part of it. Before we go, is there anything that the regular person can do to make sure that these lines are drawn fairly? Do we have any power in this uh, fight?
Well, one of the things that is often criticized about partisan gerrymandering is the only way that it really can be rectified is by electing new legislators. But that's difficult to do when the legislators draw the lines that make it difficult for them to be tossed out of office if voters are angry about it. But I think the outside of that, the clearest way to deal with this issue, if it's an issue that's of concern to you, is just raising consciousness about it. Because it seems obvious, well, maybe it's not obvious, but evident at least, that voters care about this issue, that it's stirring a lot of passions. It's not the kind of thing that's obvious um, to a regular rank and file voter, that partisan gerrymandering is a thing that happens and what the effect of it is. And so people kind of need to be informed about it and what its impacts are. And we are seeing this becoming more and more a subject of political discourse. So I think participating in that, being educated about it, and educating others about what partisan gerrymandering is and what its impacts are will hopefully then enable people to make informed decisions about uh, how to approach it and different strategies that can be used to influence the process by which districts are drawn.
Mhm. Thank you so much for that. I feel like we are doing our part. There's a question that says, why didn't Governor Schwarzenegger talk to Texas about what they were doing? And the same for California Republican lawmakers. I think I'm not, that kind of would speak to the state of mind of the governor. Do we know, did he say anything as to why he didn't say anything about Texas or to California Republican lawmakers?
I don't know if I don't know if Schwarzenegger has spoken about the situation in Texas at all. Um, I do think it's again, it's not a state problem. It's a national, or if you think it's a problem, it's a national issue. To me, it's strange to talk about what one state is doing without talking about what other states are doing.
Mhm.
So I would be curious to know what Governor Schwarzenegger is saying about how other states are doing gerrymandering and what plan he might have for if because his argument is partisan gerrymandering is bad, so we shouldn't do it.
Mhm.
Okay, so I would be curious to know, well, what's the approach to addressing how other states are doing it? Because California isn't an island; we're part of a nation of 50 states.
Absolutely. I don't know if we'll get that answer. And, I think that I don't know if you'll get that answer. And I'm not free to express my feelings either one way or the other. This is just simply informational. And I think that we did do what the mission of this meeting was to do, was really just to inform voters about the process and what it means to the election. And so I'm really grateful for you taking the time out of your night to come on and talk to us. I'm sure there are lots of other subjects that we could talk about in the same line in the civic series. So I'll probably definitely be calling you back to talk about other things. And I look forward to seeing how this election turns out and what the outcome of the redistricting actually rendered from all of this work. So
Yes, that'll
that
be
might
very
be a
interesting.
conversation we come back
Yeah.
and we put a guessing, we guess it out and see who wins and come back and maybe we'll win a gift card or something. I don't know. But I want to thank everybody for joining. We've got about 7 minutes left on the call. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. But if not, I'm going to release you all for the night and make sure you stay tuned for our next talk, which is, I think, October 9th, where we'll be talking with attorney Carmen Nicole Cox about Prop 50, kind of walking through the language in that proposition and what it all means. This is kind of something that's important to me. Last year, we didn't pass Proposition 6, which was to remove slavery from the California Constitution. And I thought that maybe people just didn't understand the language on the ballot. And so this year, my goal is to kind of demystify what the language is, and part of that process is understanding, before we talk about Prop 50, what is gerrymandering and how are these lines drawn. So thank you so much, Professor Stahl, and I will see you on Wednesday.
Thank you. It was my pleasure, and thanks for inviting me, Alana. It's really nice talking
Absolutely.
with you.
Thank you.